Hey guys, welcome to the video. I'm trying something a little different today. I'm doing voiceovers. So as you can tell, I've traced out the shape of the Bowie knife that I'm going to be making a sheath for, and I've basically, the way I've measured my welt is to measure to the ends of the guard, and then, draw a line from that shape. In cutting the leather, you want to be relatively careful not to cut towards yourself. And I prefer to cut from the rough side in and make sure to use as little of the hide as I can with each piece. There are leather cutting knives you can use, U-shaped knives called ulu knives. I prefer to use a knife that I made. It's a whittling knife slash sloyd knife. But as you see, I removed it off the hide so that it's easier to deal with, and then I can kind of peel away the bits that I don't want. So here I'm marking out my welt after cutting out the two sides, and a cheat that I use is that the shape of the cut from cutting out the original side will be the same shape as the welt needs to be on the inside of the sheath. And so I just use the marks on my template to get the depth. So, as you can see here, again, trying not to cut towards myself, I am pushing down rather than across more than anything. And when I cut it off, I'm going to check it against the template to make sure it's exactly the right shape and trim it up if I need to at that stage. With the rear welt, I could have cut it out of one piece, and ideally you would want to, but because of the sharp angle between the spine and the clip, I decided to do it out of two pieces and have the join at the junction between spine and clip. And it'll basically mold away as long as your cutting is accurate. With that stage done, I'm going to cut the welt from the template so that I have an outline of the knife, and I can use that to line up all of the further pieces in the sheath to get them all sticking down right. Now, when I line this up, you'll notice that both sides have the rough side inwards. I mirrored the template when I cut both sides out. And now I lay out the welts, and I find it's really important to mark out where the welts are going to go so that you know where to put glue, because you don't want to put glue in the area where the knife is going to sit. So, as you know, leather has a smooth side and a rough side. I tend to rough up that smooth side in order to get proper glue adhesion on both sides of the welt. So now we're ready for glue up. You'll see that it looks like I'm putting on a lot of glue, but I'm actually laying down a relatively thin bead, and I'm going to spread that out with a little offcut of leather that I tape it out. And what I like to do is get a nice even thin coat along all of the glue seams, and then allow it to dry to, basically completely dry, and then you can press the two pieces together. Obviously you apply glue to both pieces. This glue that I'm using is actually a relatively cheap glue. I believe I got it at Red Dot or a reject shop, something like that. But it is much the same as barge cement that cobblers will use. You can use that as well. There are various brands. It doesn't really matter as long as it's good contact adhesive. I tend to do tests with new contact adhesive where I'll stick two pieces together using the instructions on the packet and then try and tear them apart. And if it tears the fibers, then I know it's a good glue. But yeah, this can be a little bit of a tedious and sticky process, but in the end it's well worth it to get the shape you want and not have to screw around trying to get the holes punched and getting everything lined up. So as you can see, it's nice and dry now, and you got to be really careful lining up and dropping it in place, because basically once these glued surfaces touch, they're adhered and you can't get them apart. So I'll carefully line them up and then squeeze them down, and they're done. That's it, they're glued. You can put a book on top of them, really compress them, but I don't find it's needed with this glue. So here I'm just showing the two pieces of extra leather for the welt that'll add some width for where the spine and ricasso will sit, so that it's not over compressed. And of course, because the knife is tapered, and also because you know, the leather doesn't like a sharp step, you'll end up having a hole in your sheath. I'm going to scarf these down quite a ways to get them to smoothly mold into the rest of the sheath. You don't have to go quite as aggressive as I am, but I'm a little careful with my sheath making, and I want to make sure that I'm not going to have any pockets or gaps except at the very tip of the sheath. So here you can see I've glued it up and I'm getting everything placed. I almost stuck it in the wrong spot there, but managed to get everything stuck. You want to make sure that you've got exactly the right shape at the end. If you don't glue it right, then you're going to have to cut it apart in order to get it apart. Here I'm just chasing a piece of glue that got onto the surface. You can normally rub it with your finger and get it to ball up and come off. Sometimes it doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to check fit before I stitch anything or anything like that. And I can see here that it binds with the guard a little bit. If it was too tight, I'd also have to cut it apart and add more welt. So I'm going to use the grinder to shape the sheath. At the moment I'm using a 40 grit. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to cut all the shape in, smooth out the sides, get them all even. And this will help me when it comes to stitching and grooving and marking out. You can do this with the knife if you're a little more accurate. I just prefer to use the grinder to dial everything in. So once we're ground up, you can see the transition of the welt on both sides. There's the other one. And what I've got here is a little stitching groover. Now the space between the main shaft and the groover is the spacing you're going to have for your groove. As you can see, it's actually quite a satisfying tool to use. And you basically just run the stem along the side of the sheath, and the groover cuts a gouge for the stitching to sit in. In this case, I'm going to double cut them because I want the stitches to sit below the face of the sheath, but you could just cut a single groove like I just did there, and that would be fine. So once your groove is established, it gives you the distance and a marker for where you need to mark your stitches. And these are called stitching wheels, and they come in various shapes and sizes. Obviously, the larger the wheel, or normally the further apart the stitches. And these are stitching forks. They're used as a punch. You actually use them with a hammer to punch the holes. But in this case, because it's such a thick piece of material, the punches wouldn't go all the way through anyway, and they get stuck. So what we're going to use is a stitching wheel. This is quite a large stitching wheel, and basically we're just going to run it along the groove, pressing down as we do, and that's going to give us a series of marks for where to punch holes. And I'm going to run around the entire surface. You could use a stitching tool like that as a marker if you didn't have it. I use a fork sometimes before I had stitching wheels. And you just basically put one tine in the previous hole, and then you can mark your stitching marks. Once the stitch positions are marked, you're going to need to punch the holes. These are hand awls that you can use by hand to punch individual holes. On the right we have a round awl, and in the middle there we have a square awl. Or this is actually a diamond awl. It's a very old diamond awl, not very sharp. But those are used to punch individual holes. We also have stitching awls. You might be familiar with these. Sometimes they have a spool of thread on them. And they're actually used similar to a sewing machine. You would push through the material and then thread through the loop. Or, in this case, you actually push the awl through first and then put a loop of string on it and pull the loop back through, and then you push a line through that, much like a sewing machine action. But we won't use any of these because I've got something a little bit more efficient for these big sheaths. Let's go out to the shed and take a look. Okay guys, so here we are. I've switched to, my actual voice now because I don't have music playing in the background. But I know that a lot of the professional leatherworkers and anyone who knows anything about leatherworking are going to be screaming at the screen right now, seeing me setting up with a drill. A lot of people give me a lot of shit about this. Now, this can be done if you put a harness needle in the drill. Just sharpen up the harness needle a little bit with some sandpaper in the drill on the side of it, and then you can push through with the drill running, and that'll burnish the hole for you. I honestly can't be bothered doing that because this does just as good a job, and given the thickness of leather I'm working with and all that kind of stuff, this gives me just as good a result as anything else. For thinner leathers, absolutely punch them. Punch them with either an awl or whatever you might have handy. But for this thick veg tan, which is going to get beat up anyway, the drill does just fine. Okay, so we have the stitches drilled in, and now I don't do this beforehand because you don't know if it's going to line up properly, but now that I've got them drilled, I can take the stitching groover and groove between those holes. And again, I'm going to double cut the grooves so the stitches sit below the level of the leather, and that way they're less likely to wear down over time if they get worn on the hip and that kind of thing. You can only do that with relatively thick leather, however. As you can see, it pulls over the lever a little bit, so we're going to take the polished round awl. I'm going to go through each hole from both sides, and we're going to burnish the inside of the hole and just widen it ever so slightly. And that's going to make it so much easier for us to stitch, because as you can see here, the holes next to the burnished hole are all closed off, whereas the one we burnished is nice and wide open. So you may be wondering at this stage, given that I've pretty much pre-stitched my sheath together and I haven't done any of the tooling, how I'm going to do the tooling without crushing the sheath. And this is my little trick. Now, you should use something like MDF, like 5mm thick MDF, but I don't have any of that on hand at the moment, and seeing as all the stores are closed, I'm instead using this piece of advertising board, sometimes known as refrigerator board, which is just, kind of corrugated plastic. And this is going to act as a riser to go inside the sheath to protect the sheath from being crushed while I'm tooling on it. And also to protect the underside when I go to punch the holes for the snaps. So yeah, this is a little trick that I picked up watching a lot of leather workers do their thing. So with that riser in place, I can now mark the center with my punch and punch the holes for my snaps. And I'm using 2 snaps for this one because it's quite a large Bowie, but you can get away with 1. Traditionally you use a frog stud, but I don't have a mill, and I prefer the snaps anyway, so there you are. So you can just see the 2 posts from the snap stud mounts in there. I'm going to put the anvil in underneath them, and then using the punch that come with the snap kit, I'm going to punch them in place. And then Bob's your auntie, Fran's your uncle, they're fitted in place and ready to mount the frog to. You'll notice that the sheath still isn't stitched up. That glue is solid as, and it's not coming apart. Okay, so now we come to stitching. These are just the supplies that I'm going to try and make use of. Got nickel-plated harness needles. You can get these from most leatherworking supplies. You're going to need 2 of those because we're going to be doing a saddle stitch, and I'm going to be using this wax cotton thread. You can use something like this synthetic sinew, artificial sinew, or even Dacron DB50 bowstring. I've used that quite a few times before, but I still have this nylon thread. If you're using the Dacron, you definitely want to have your beeswax, because the Dacron isn't very waxed. You want to wax it up good so that it sticks together. But with the waxed nylon thread, this is a very high tensile thread. It's designed for stitching, and I'm going to use an arm's breadth. So I'm going to use both my arms stretched out wide to measure, and that's about the maximum length that I'll use on anything. And we're just going to thread it through the needle, and then this is a problem that you run into. Just straighten it up, twist it up again, and feed it back through. Do not try and pull it all the way through. Once you have it threaded, if you pass the needle through the line, through the fiber, and pull it through, that is what we call a knotless knot. And it'll stop the needle from becoming unspooled. You can do it twice, you can do it once, and it'll just stop that knot from coming undone. Wax the thread whenever you manipulate it, put them together, and you're done. And then with this piece of leather, we can protect the jaws of the clamp, and that clamp is going to help us hold the piece vertical so that we can stitch from both sides easily. You can also use a vise or a clamp on a table, but this is just one way of doing it. You will see that I'll move to a vise later. Okay, so we're ready to stitch. We've got our two needles on one piece of thread. You're going to feed through from one side and then stretch them out so that they're both equidistant from that hole. You don't want to get them crossed, so make sure you have them on the right sides. And then it doesn't matter which side you feed through from first, just feed it through, leave a loop on one side, pull that tight against the wall, and then push the other needle through, wrap it round, and pull that needle through. And what that does is ties a knot in the thread, which means that then if that thread busts, the rest of them won't come unraveled. You pull it tight, and you just keep threading like that, one after the other. Like I said, it doesn't matter which side you start from. Don't alternate, because what you'll find is you'll actually shorten one faster than the other. I tend to work from my right side, but you can work from the left. It doesn't really matter, again. But either way you do it, you want to push through halfway with your second needle, wrap the cord around, and then pull it through, so that you're constantly creating that knot, so that the thread will not come undone if you bust a thread in the future. If you were to just feed it in and out, or just crossways, then if you busted one thread, all the other threads could loosen. So as you can see, just going through, continue stitching. Make sure you do not push the needle through the thread at any point. If you push through the thread a little bit, back the needle out and go again. That's why I pull the cord towards me in order to stitch, so that I don't accidentally cross thread. So we've now reached the stage where we've got to the end of the line and we can no longer create a loop long enough to continue looping around the second needle. So we're going to do this last stitch. Just wanted to show you that it's getting a bit short. And then I'm going to show you how we finish a stitch in order to start the next one. What we're going to do is pass through like we normally would. Create that loop. Hold the loop open. Push through, making sure not to cross thread. And then when we spin it, we're going to loop it around once, twice, 3 times. And then we're going to pull it through. And that just creates a little bit of extra security in the knot. Pull it super tight. And then I'm going to cut that off. Flush with the leather. I want to cut it off as physically close as possible without actually cutting the stitch. And that's going to be almost invisible when we come to put the next stitch in. Make sure to cut your tag ends off the needles, because then we're going to thread another double arm's breadth of cord on. I'm going to feed that back in and start afresh. Okay, so I've threaded my new set of needles, and we don't want to start on the next hole from where we finished, because that would leave an empty slot. What we want to do is push through where we finished the last knot, where the last knot is. It's a little tight because obviously there's already the knot in there, but get it through, again pull it out so that it's equidistant from that point, so that we have equal amounts of thread on both sides. A little bit tough. But you don't have to create a knot in that hole again, because you're just pulling it through to cast off into the new line. And then we can just start stitching like we did before. Again, I'm coming in from the right. You'll notice that the longer thread tends to get twisted and a little bit bunched up, and that's why I won't normally use anything longer than a double arm's breadth. For a big sheath, you can normally expect to use 3 or 4 pieces. For a small sheath, you might get 1. The other advantage is even if you do manage to unravel one bit of thread, then because you've used multiple, the others won't. Okay, so we're at the last stitch. This is actually my 3rd piece, and we've got 1 more hole to go. We're going to go through that, hold it open, push through the 2nd needle. This time, like we're finishing off, we're going to put 3 wraps, pull that through. A little tough. Cinch that knot down. But now what we're going to do is, you can do this multiple times, but I only tend to go back 1. I'm going to go back 1 step and push through. I have a little trouble getting this through, and you might have the same, so this is why I keep a pair of pliers on hand, so that I can pull needles through if I need to. Especially if you're using a punch, sometimes the hole can be quite tight on the needle. And so I'm just going to push that through with the pliers, hoping to keep a little bit of a loop. That almost pulled it all the way through. That would have been disastrous. And then I'm going to get the needle again, same deal, rinse, repeat, push it back through. But in this case, because there's already thread in there, I only really want to put 1 stitch in, like I normally would, like 1 tie. So I'm going to wrap twice, and then pull it through, cinch it down, and that just adds a little bit of reinforcement at the top of the stitch. And then I'm just going to cut those off flush with the sides of the leather. Voila. With the sheath stitched, we now have cut out the frog. Now, I had a template already designed for the frog, and I cut that out off camera. The frog just basically has to wrap around the sheath and be able to snap in place. What I did was made a paper template that wrapped around the sheath itself. I actually made the sheath first, and then I made the belt loop long enough that it was going to dangle down a reasonable distance so that the handle was about in line with my belt. And that's going to be the perfect size for our frog. And first things first, I'm going to skive down the end of the belt loop that's going to fold around back down into the frog, because I want the smooth side on the outside of the belt loop. And that's then going to be glued and stitched in place. Because this is much thinner leather, and I don't have a welt, I can use the diamond punches, the punching forks. They do get a little stuck, but you'll notice that I have a piece of leather behind them so that they can go all the way through, leaving a parallel-sided hole. And I'm going to make a big rectangle, because that's going to be way more secure than a single line of stitching. Same deal, stitching the frog, the belt loop. I'm just using sinew in this case because it sits a lot lower profile, and because the tip is going to be passing past this stitching, I don't want the tip to catch on the stitching and bust it open. So having that sinew laying nice and flat, especially given that the leather is so thin I can't groove it, is going to lower the risk of that happening. And I'm doing the same saddle stitch I was for the sheath, this way that even if the tip does bust through a single stitch, that belt loop still isn't coming open. Unlike with the nylon, I'm actually going to tie this off and burn it so that I can get it to sit flush, because artificial sinew doesn't really hold knots very well. So there you go. And here I've marked the positions of the snaps that are going to go through the frog, and I want to do this before I fold and stitch the frog. And I'm going to mount those snaps in place, so that they're ready to go when we finally finish the frog's stitching, because that's obviously going to be folded over and stitched in place to allow it to hold the sheath. This is one of the last things I do to the sheath before a final finish, is I'm going to sand all the edges with 240 and 400 grit sandpaper, round them out, smooth them out, ready for burnishing. And to fit the frog, I'm going to wrap my vice jaws in Glad Wrap. That's just to protect the leather from being stained by all the stuff that's on my vice. And then I'm going to wet the frog, which you can see it's nice and floppy there, snap it in place, stretch it around the sheath, and then clamp it in place. Takes a little bit of finagling, but then I'm going to leave that to dry overnight. As you can see, the frog is dried nicely. It's nice and solid. And I'm going to glue that together in preparation for stitching. And again, because it's a relatively thin piece of material, I'm going to use the stitching forks to punch holes. Again, they get stuck, and this actually goes to shambles. I end up mashing the nice wet forming I did, but that's okay because I can go back and do that afterwards. This at least gives me a nice marker for where I need to stitch. And I'm just going to do that as much as I can, knock that out. And you don't want your diamond punches to go too close to the edge because you can bust them out. So, much like with the sheath, I'm using the nylon cord because I want everything to match. And I'm going to stitch that, do the finishing stitch like I did on the sheath. And that tab is well over length, but I want to leave it there because it just gives me a little bit more room. And then we fit it on the sheath, and you can see what it's going to look like in the end. I'll eventually cut that tab off very close to the stitching, just to make it low profile. Here I'm starting to add a little bit of design elements to the piece. Unfortunately I mess up a little bit, and there's a dip in the leather that I didn't see, so the stitching groover ends up leaving this really wonky line around the, the snap, but c'est la vie. And with wood behind it, I'm going to moisten the surface of the leather. I don't want to soak it, just want to moisten it so that these leather punches will work on it. And I'm just going to position those, kind of arbitrarily figure it out by eye. I could plan it out, but I like to play with designs a little bit. And I'm just going to knock those in around the border until I have a pattern that I kind of like. Repeating or not repeating, symmetrical or asymmetrical, it kind of depends, but you want to make sure that you have relatively moist leather when you do this, and that way it'll retain that marking a lot easier. So I'm going to do the same thing with the sheath. I'm going to put that riser in there and moisten the leather down so that it'll take the marks better. And I'm going to use the same pattern I used on the frog so that it all kind of melds together, all meshes really nicely visually. You can see that there's a lot of discoloration and marking on the leather. That's going to disappear when we dye the leather. But this little bit of extra border work, like even though it's not the most intrinsically kind of pretty marking, there are a lot of guys out there who do a lot better tooling job than I do on leather. This just adds that little bit of flair that kind of speaks of the handmade quality of the leatherwork. I'm kind of a minimalist when it comes to this kind of thing. I don't really like overly carved sheaths, but this is a nice little decorative touch that I think adds a little bit of pop to the look of the sheath. Last but not least, before dyeing, I'm going to add my maker's mark. This is actually a steel maker's mark, but it works for leather as well. And I like to put it in a spot where it's not immediately obvious, especially when the frog is on. So now it's time to dye. I've moistened the sheath, I'm using this RIT fabric dye. It's not really designed for leather, but I couldn't actually get leather dye during this crisis, so I'm going to give this a shot. I've seen a couple people use it, and they seem to have decent results. And I wasn't too unimpressed. This is supposed to be a black dye, but it actually comes out kind of dark brown, which I really like. I'm a big fan of brown colors. And the pigment didn't take up that well. It kind of floated on the surface a little bit. It will rub off over time, but it'll give it a nice aged look. So with them fully dyed up and dried, we can now apply wax. Now I really like Renaissance wax for leatherwork. It shines up the best, it's the best protective that I've found. You only have to use a tiny bit of it and you get a really spectacular result. So I'm going to apply a decent layer of Renaissance wax, let that dry, and then buff it. This is a trick I picked up from another leatherworker. This is a piece of mirror polished antler, and I use it as a burnishing tool to get those edges blended in really nicely. And what this does is get all of the kind of raw fibers at the edge of the leather to lay flat. And using the wax a little bit, you can add a little bit more wax if you want, it gets that really nice burnished look. Finally, I'm going to use this leather brush to quickly buff over the surface. I'm going to get pretty aggressive with it. I want to buff that surface to a mirror shine almost. Just keep going over it until that Renaissance wax really reflects that light. And here we go, the finished sheath. You can see how beautiful that shine work is. It snaps on and off relatively easily, and the knife fits perfectly. Altogether, it looks like a really nice kind of rustic but modern aesthetic. It's something that I really enjoy. I was really happy with this outcome. And here we go, just showing it on the hip. It's really comfortable to wear. Blade fits in and out nice and smoothly. It's actually really easy to draw and resheath. The snaps, it's a little tight, but I'd prefer it to be a little tight than a little loose. It takes a little bit of work to get them off, but the idea is that you can remove the sheath and knife without having to remove the frog or having to remove your belt, which is something that I really like about these kinds of sheaths. It means you don't have to take your belt off to take your knife off. And then it just slides in, snaps back in place, and you're ready to go. So there you go, guys. The finished sheath. Actually quite happy with how it came out, given the difficulties I had in sourcing a few of the materials that I needed. This quarantine has been quite disruptive to my creative outlets. But yeah, the dye worked okay. I'm actually pretty happy with it. It's a little spotchy in a couple of places. And it didn't take to the leather as well as standard leather dye, but leather dye being relatively hard to get at the moment, I'm pretty happy with the overall result. Now, this is going to be available on my Etsy page, not just the sheath, the knife as well. This knife, along with the sheath, will be available from my Etsy store as of the upload of this video. So when this video goes live, oops, I just put the blade in the wrong way around because that's what smart people do. When this video goes live, this knife and sheath combo will be available on my Etsy page. So if you're interested in owning this one-of-a-kind, it's shipping free everywhere in the world, so let me know. Well, go to my Etsy page, which will be linked down in the description below, and you can purchase this one-of-a-kind knife. With that being said, if you are able to see this video, that would be because my patrons have allowed you to see it. This was filmed as a kind of in-depth video on how to make a sheath in-depth. How I make a sheath is I'm not a professional sheath maker. I've made quite a few sheaths over the years and I've kind of worked out what works for me and what doesn't. There are certain things that some people won't do, and there are certain people that will do the same thing as me. It all depends. Everyone's different. Get as many opinions as you can. But yes, you have to thank my patrons, my wonderful, wonderful patrons, who I'm going to list up here, for allowing this video to go public. If not, then this is for my patrons, in which case, thank you guys so much for your support. But either way, there will be a video out of this build. I have greatly enjoyed doing it. I have a number of other projects coming up very soon, and lots of more tips and tricks videos in the near future. So if you're interested in that, please hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit that bell notification icon to be notified of when I upload a new video. Otherwise, YouTube won't let you know, and you'll miss them. I also go live on Saturdays at 9 AM Australian Western Standard Time. I normally spend some time in the Forge making some cool stuff, so please feel free to come and hang out. If you want to join the Patreon family and become a member of this list, then the links will be down in the description below. You can help support my channel, and you guys keep this channel running. So, with that being said, I'm going to jump off now. I hope you're all staying safe, or hope you're all staying sane, and I hope you're all taking the chance to make something, even if it's something small, in the time that you have, thanks to this horrible pandemic. Anyway, take it easy, guys, and I'll see you next time.